Here's John Lennox to misunderstand how science works.
John, I heard that you wrote a little book, and it's being read around the world, called Can Science Explain Everything? Why is everyone talking about this book so much?
I've never even heard of that book.
It addresses a feeling that's very widespread, that science has been so successful. Look at the technology it has produced. Surely in the end, it will answer everything.
Who's even arguing that? That doesn't logically follow from the mere fact that science has been used to invent lots of technologies.
And push religion right out to the side, and especially any ideas of God. And I want to combat that. And I want to say that science is powerful. I love it, but it's limited. And it's easy to see that it's limited.
I don't know of any scientists or anyone who understands how science works who doesn't know that science can't confirm or negate untestable, non-falsifiable claims.
There's a very brilliant Nobel Prize winner called Sir Peter Medawar, and he once said it's so easy to see that science is limited because it cannot even answer the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life?
I'm pretty sure science has answered where do I come from. We come from the chemicals that are found on the earth and of which we are comprised. Even if you're an apologist, you shouldn't have a problem with this explanation because it's consistent with the Bible, which says that we are made from the dust of the ground.
And he hit on something very important there. The late Lord Sachs, who was the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, wrote a book once. He was a brilliant philosopher. And he said something roughly like this: science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And the point is that science can answer many questions, but it cannot answer the questions of meaning.
I'm not sure what Lennox means by meaning, but he seems to be using the term to mean purpose. I think he wants to know what purpose humans exist to serve. Of course, this assumes baselessly that there is a purpose that we exist to serve.
We often put it this way, that science answers mainly the how questions and the why questions of function. Why is that bit there? But it cannot deal with the why questions of purpose.
Aren't we skipping a step here? Shouldn't we be investigating whether we have a purpose before we start looking for what that purpose is? And I would pose a more basic question, which is why should we care if we were created for a purpose? I didn't ask to be born, so why should I have any obligation to fulfill any preordained purpose that I never agreed to serve in the first place?
And I often illustrate this by telling a story about a fictitious Aunt Matilda who's baked a beautiful cake, and there it is in front of us. And she presents it to an assembly of all the Nobel Prize winners and asks them to analyze the cake. So you get a brilliant chemical analysis, you get an analysis in terms of biology and physics, in terms of quarks and electrons and everything else. And they give you a huge and perfect analysis. And when they've finished, she says, now, just before you go, please tell me why the cake was made.
She probably could have received an answer if the experts assembled were not contained to being Nobel Prize winners, because there's no Nobel Prize for psychology. If you want a scientific assessment of motivation, that's who is best to ask, not physicists and chemists. Lennox is framing motivation as though it's a subject entirely outside of the purview of science. It isn't.
And she begins to grin. And the physicist, well, he can tell what it's made of, but he can't tell why she made the cake. And nor can the chemist, and nor can anybody else, not even the mathematicians who don't get Nobel Prizes.
Then what were they doing there? You said this was an assembly of all the Nobel Prize winners. If mathematicians were there, then it couldn't have only been Nobel Prize winners. But I guess it still didn't include any psychologists.
None of them can tell her why. Only she can if she reveals it to them. Now, this is a very simple analogy, but it's hugely important because it's the same with the universe. We can examine what it's made of and get brilliant scientific theories, but to understand why it was made and why we were made, God who created it will have to reveal it to us. Now, here's the important thing. When Aunt Matilda reveals it to us, we don't shut our reason off. We use our reason to understand her revelation. And just as we use our reason to understand science, how it works, we use our reason to understand her explanation of why she made it. And it's exactly the same, because so many people think that faith is a religious word. It means believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. Faith is an ordinary word. It means trust, and it's as important in science as it is in any other field.
In the Bible, faith is given a very specific meaning. Hebrews 11:1 defines it as confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. In other words, faith, according to the Bible, is, by definition, wishful thinking about that which is not evident. Apologists often try to define faith as merely inductive inference. It's not. Not according to the Bible. Inductive inference is based on evidence. Faith, as the Bible defines it, is assurance of that which is not evident.
And that's why I say that we need to distinguish between these two explanations.
Why are people, do you think, so committed in the academic fields to not believing in God?
What makes you think they're committed to not believing in God? Why can't it just be the case that they're simply not convinced? I'm not committed to not believing in God. I'm just not convinced.
And they've done a fantastic job of making us think that we're the ones who believe fantastical things. But really, it's the ones who deny God who appear to me to be living in this fantasy world that out of nothing, everything comes.
I don't believe that anything, let alone everything, came out of nothing. I don't believe there ever was nothing. I don't know if Mike Seaver believes in creation ex nihilo, but most Christians seem to. And that's the doctrine that God made everything out of nothing. So obviously those Christians don't have any problem with the idea that you can get something out of nothing.
Sometimes when I'm talking to scientists, I'll say, what do you do science with? And they will talk about some expensive equipment, and I point to my head and I say this. Oh, they said, you mean your, and they're about to say mind when they know that it's not politically correct to believe in the mind. So they say your brain, you do science for your brain. I say, okay.
I have a lot of trouble believing that scientists are afraid to say the word mind because it's too politically incorrect.
I believe the brain and the mind are separate, but that's another discussion. You do science with your brain. Give me the short history of the brain. And they come up with something like this. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and smile and I say, and you trust it?
No, I don't trust it. That's why science has to be so rigorous. That's why Richard Feynman said the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. You're the easiest person to fool because your mind can definitely not be trusted. By the way, this is the case even if there is a God that created our minds. Even if our minds are created by a perfect, infallible God, it's clearly the case that he did not make us to be infallible, which is weird given that he's supposed to be perfectly loving. Even if we were created by God, we still can't trust our own minds.
I said, tell me honestly, if you knew that the computer that you use every day for doing your science was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it?
If a computer that evolved, rather than being designed, produced information that consistently matched observation, I would only trust it insofar as it continued to do so. But I would always be aware that it is potentially fallible. That's the same attitude I have toward my own mind. And it's the attitude I would have toward it even if I did believe in God.
Now, here's the interesting thing. I have always got the answer no. And I say to them, you have a problem, don't you? Because you are giving me an explanation of your brain mind that you wouldn't accept in any other area.
That's not true. The explanation is evolution. I'd accept that explanation for the vast majority of biological phenomena.
Atheism gives you no ground for trusting the rationality you need to do science.
You don't need to trust rationality to do science. If science trusted rationality, they'd never bother to check their calculations with an empirical test. If you could trust rationality, there would have been no need for Eddington to test Einstein's equations by looking at whether they match observation. We could all have simply trusted the math. The empirical sciences are all about not trusting the math. They're about testing the math. They're about testing whether our rational inferences match observation precisely because we can't completely trust rationality.
So what atheism does is not only shoot you in the foot, and that's painful, it shoots you in the head, and that's fatal.
You're speaking in ways that remind me of C.S. Lewis and making similar types of arguments, and it's so refreshing to hear this. Do you address in your book the objection that somebody might make, well, your Matilda argument sounds great and your teapot argument sounds great because she wanted to make the cake. There is a purpose. Someone wanted a cup of tea. But you cannot assume that the universe was made for a reason. We can pull it apart, we can describe how it works, but doesn't it just take faith to believe that there's actually a purpose and a meaning behind it all? What say there is no purpose or meaning?
Well, of course it does. You can assume that there's no purpose or meaning, but then that's the stop.
Lennox seems to think that there are only two options here. Either assume that there's a meaning or assume that there's no meaning. How about being agnostic toward whether there's a meaning? What's wrong with that? We could then investigate whether there's a purpose or meaning. Shouldn't that be the starting point with respect to that issue? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.